Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto and I'm a photographer. And in this video I'm gonna share some camera settings that are perfect, the best for every situation. Okay, I'm only kidding. I'm sharing some settings that I find work well for my photography, but I hope they can also work well for your photography. The reason for this video is that I get all these questions all the time about camera settings, and camera settings somehow seems to be a topic that never goes out of fashion, even though there are already thousands or maybe even millions of camera settings videos here on YouTube. So I thought it's no harm to share one more video because people seem to ask about the settings all the time. My absolute favorite exposure mode for all kinds of general snapping is P. Yes, P, professional program mode. Because most modern cameras choose very sensible exposure values regardless of the situation. And the camera probably chooses very similar exposure values that you would choose yourself if you would choose them instead of the camera. I use the P mode almost all the time when I'm using my Ricoh GR3 or 3X cameras, and also when I'm shooting photos with my Sony ZV-1 camera. And I think there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of using P mode. I think it's only smart to let your smart camera do its smart thing so you can concentrate more on your photography, your subject, your composition and all that. Besides, you can override the settings that the camera selected anytime you want. Just turn one of the command dials on your camera and you can choose better settings with just one or two clicks. Let's say the camera suggests f5.6, 1/252, ISO 100, but you want a faster shutter speed. With a couple of clicks on the command dial, you can choose f2.8, 1/500 and ISO 100. Very quick and easy and convenient. And if the picture looks too bright or too dark, you can always dial in some exposure compensation and make the brightness to your liking. Very easy and convenient, and I really think P mode is the best mode for all kinds of general shooting, and especially if you're using a tiny sensor camera like this ZV-1, which has very little control over the depth of field. The P mode is even better on cameras like this, but it works so well with any camera, whether it's a full frame camera, APS-C camera, or 1-inch type sensor camera or micro four thirds, whatever. P mode is, in my opinion, the best and easiest for all kinds of general shooting. However, there are some situations, some scenarios where you want to be sure that you have certain specific settings. And I'm talking about street shooting in traditional sense. You probably want to have quite a lot of depth of field, but you also want to be able to freeze action, for example, walking people on the street. And for that, I recommend aperture priority and auto ISO with minimum shutter speed of 1/250, because 1/250 is enough to stop a walking person on the street. And aperture priority so that you can control the depth of field. And the required aperture or preferred aperture depends on your sensor size and your lens, of course. But the rule of thumb or general rule could be that on micro four thirds camera you want to be around f5.6, on an APS-C camera like the Ricoh you want to be around f8, and on a full frame camera you want to be around f11. Of course, you can fine-tune your depth of field by choosing a little bit a lower f number or higher f number depending on the situation, but as a rule of thumb those values are a good starting point anyway. And yes, it's inevitable that those exposure values can lead to pretty high ISO values in some situations. Let's say you have f8 1/250 and it's a cloudy day and you are shooting in the shade, you will probably end up having quite high ISO value. But if you're shooting traditional street photos, I think capturing the moment is much more important than some little noise in your final picture. Besides, there are so many good noise suppression, noise denoising applications today that you can probably remove most of the noise if that is distracting in your final picture. For nighttime low light shooting, I have some different settings, and these settings can also work for any kind of shooting where you want action stopping power, even in bright daylight. With the Ricoh GR3 and 3X cameras, I use the shutter priority mode in low light if I'm out there in the city shooting some relatively low light street photos, for example. Because in low light I'm pretty much shooting wide open anyway, so the shutter speed is what I want to control. And usually I choose the kind of shutter speed that I can handhold comfortably. And most of the time I'm willing to allow some motion blur in my pictures. I don't care. However, if I, for whatever reason, want to freeze action in my pictures, then I just choose a faster shutter speed, and I'm on auto ISO of course all the time, and with the shutter speed I can also balance between the action stopping capability and the noise in my pictures, because of course the faster the shutter speed, the higher the ISO and the more noise in my pictures. Usually I don't mind some noise in my pictures. I'm not allergic to noise, but that is something to keep in mind just in case you happen to be a little bit allergic to noise in your pictures. However, if I'm using my Sony A7 Mark IV in low light, I'm using aperture priority and auto ISO. Let me explain why. First of all, the Sony has a bigger sensor than my Ricoh. So with the same angle of view and the same aperture, I get less depth of field. And for the Sony, I have different types of lenses with brighter maximum aperture than what I have in the Ricoh GR or GR3X. So I think it's more important to be able to control the depth of field, and that's why aperture priority. And then if my camera gives me unsuitable shutter speed for the situation with auto ISO, I can always turn that ISO dial and fine-tune my shutter speed to where I want it. Yes, you heard it right. I'm using the ISO dial to select my shutter speed. That may sound like confusing, but let me explain again. Because I want to be able to control my aperture and my depth of field, I'm on A mode, aperture priority mode. And especially in low light, I find that the ISO dial is just the perfect dial to balance between the shutter speed and the ISO value or the noise levels in my picture. And I just feel it works better than shutter priority, especially in low light. And if this sounds like confusing, please ignore this and do it your way. But what about M mode, fully manual mode? I think the only reason to use fully manual settings is in a situation where the lighting is constant. In a studio, for example, then it makes a lot of sense to use all manual settings and set every exposure value manually, because the lighting is not going to change anywhere. And then when and if you are doing any post-processing, you can also apply the same settings to all your pictures, because the exposure is identical in every single picture. At first it seems like the M mode is the ultimate exposure mode, and it gives you the ultimate control over every setting. You can choose whatever settings you wish, but that is simply not true. The lighting conditions determine the boundaries for your settings. You can't choose any settings you like. You have to stick within the boundaries and use the settings that work in any given lighting situation. Whether you want to stop action, you want to have a lot of depth of field or whatever, you have to choose your values accordingly. And as we all know, all those values, aperture, shutter speed and ISO, they are all connected. So if you change one value, you have to change also at least one other value. So you can't simply choose whatever values you wish even on M mode. So in the end, it may be that the camera is controlling you. You are fumbling with the settings and you miss the shot. So in most situations, it makes sense to use one of the automatic exposure modes and let the camera do part of the job that it's supposed to be doing and the job that it does the best. So you can concentrate on your photography, your subject, your composition, and all those things. But of course, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with the fully manual mode, and if you get good results and if it makes you feel happy, please by all means use it and ignore everything I said in this video previously. This is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed these camera setting tips and tricks, and if this was helpful, please do consider buying me a cup of coffee. There's a link down below for that if you don't live in Finland. And here is one video about denoising. Please check it out if you find your pictures too noisy. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll definitely see you again in the next video.